Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest edition, this latest episode of the Time for Impact podcast. I'm Chris Wade, one of your hosts, and my fellow host is, of course, also here, Matt Cobble. How are you, Matt?
Hi, Chris. I am good, thank you. Although I know it feels like we've got into the habit of describing the weather on our podcast. Today I'm sat here on a wet, rainy evening, but I'm hoping that our conversation will change how I feel about that evening and make me feel more positive about the world and about volunteering and participation and citizenship, which maybe is a bit of a teaser for what we're about to talk about.
Yeah, how very British to talk about the weather anyway. Although, as you know, Matt, we have listeners all over the world, but they'll know the English obsession with talking about the weather, so that I'm sure we'll be forgiven. And yes, hopefully we're going to get a much sunnier outlook after talking to our guest today. And our guest today is Irenie Ekkeshis from the New Citizens Project. I've known Irenie and the team and John and others for, well, as has Matt, for quite some time. I think it was about 2016, 17. One of my colleagues or acquaintances I knew from Parkinson's UK said to me, "You've got to get yourself on the New Citizenship Project," as it was then, membership boot camp. And I thought, well, I've never been on a boot camp before, so I've got to sign up for that. And I'd just taken over responsibility for membership at the M&D Association. It was not really going anywhere, membership at that time. So I thought, well, I really need something like this to really start to rethink how we turn membership into something other than collecting the membership fees and sending people to an AGM occasionally. So I went on a boot camp, and I've got to say, Irenie, it was arguably the best training course I ever went on. It was certainly up there. It was one of the most inspiring days that I've had in a training course. So I can't give you much more praise than that, can I really? And since then, we've worked, as we may discover, we've worked on work at the M&D Association and beyond.
That's really great to hear, though. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if you still do the boot camps, but if you do, I certainly recommend it to people.
You know what? We're just about to refresh our work and thinking on membership. So I don't think we're going to call them boot camps at this time. Yeah, we'll definitely be offering some sort of training. So that's really good. That's really good.
There you go. I'm disappointed it's not a boot camp, but I'm delighted you're doing them again. So yeah, and since then, many of the listeners, I hope, will have heard of your work and maybe have read John Alexander's book, Citizens, which I certainly also recommend to people, and we may get onto some of that as we go. But why don't you start by telling us a bit of your backstory, how you got into all this, and of course about the New Citizens Project.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, it's really nice to be with you both. And yeah, maybe I'll just say a little bit about how I came into this work. So, because I think it is quite relevant for hopefully what we're going to be talking about. So back in 2011, so quite some time ago, I was working in travel at the time, nothing to do with what I do now, but I worked in a cultural and archaeological tour operator. I was doing accompanying groups around the world on these amazing archaeological and cultural tours, often accompanied by museum curators. It was it was fantastic. I got to go to some of the most far-flung destinations and see some of the world's most amazing sites. And around that time, unfortunately, I got a very rare but very severe eye infection in my right eye, which was exacerbated by the contact lens that I was wearing in my eye. And to cut a very, very, very long story short, which you can also read about in the book, I basically had this kind of complete loss of control and agency over the course of my own life. So I had to sort of surrender to what the doctors were recommending in terms of course of treatment. At the same time, I lost my job, confidence went down, and social life became non-existent. I just was existing rather than kind of living my life, and doing taking a lot of medication and not really able to function. And it was a really horrendous time. During that time, did loads of soul searching about why it happened to me, what could have happened differently to stop this from occurring. And it turns out that the infection that I got was entirely preventable. So it was a contact lens related infection that's caused by a microbe that lives in our water, in our domestic water supply, and also in other water supplies, so in seas, rivers, lakes, whatever. And basically, this microbe had got into my eye via the contact lens that I was wearing and caused a really, really horrible infection in my cornea. But it was 100% preventable. If I had known at the time that there was a risk of contact lenses being exposed to water for this infection, then I might not have exposed my lenses to water, and it might never have happened. And the impact on my life of this infection sounds like eye infection sounds like, oh, it's just a couple of weeks of treatment or whatever. My treatment went on for 3 years, active treatment, and to be honest, I'm still having treatment for it now. But and kind of realised that there was no information about this infection, that I hadn't received any information about the risk factors of exposing your lenses to water when I was wearing my contact lenses, and I'd been a kind of contact lens wearer for 20 years before that. Anyway, and I realised that it could have been prevented, and that just made me really angry. It gave me a lot of fire in my belly, made me want to change things, and at a point where nothing else, I had no control of any other aspect of my life. This was the one thing that maybe I could talk about, try and make change in, try and create some sort of positive outcome from this awful, horrendous experience that I'd had. So I ended up from my sofa at home with the curtains drawn, because I was so light sensitive. I couldn't really go out or do things. I kind of taught myself Twitter at the time, and then started to lobby the contact lens industry for more prominent and more regular warnings on contact lens packaging about this issue, and got lots of doors kind of slammed in my face. People thought I was agitating. And eventually somebody opened a little door and let me step through and let me say what it was that I thought needed to happen. And from that, lots of things kind of snowballed, and I managed to persuade, with the assistance and support of lots and lots of people, it wasn't just me, but managed to persuade the British Contact Lens Association to support and start to run warnings on contact lens packaging. We ended up starting a patient group within the hospital that were looking after me at Moorfields, and then that turned into a kind of global support group that was on social media, which still exists today. It started off with 30 members, ended up with more than 1,000. It's a very rare disease, by the way, so yeah. Not many people impacted by this thing, and it can rob you of your sight, as it did for me. So I didn't say, yeah, my sight never returned in my right eye. But anyway, I basically started to become really active in trying to make change in this. And I've got to say, at a time when I'd lost complete agency and control over my life, it really gave me a sense of purpose, a sense of being able to still be useful in life, a sense of being able to do and shape something that really, really mattered. And that helped me with my mental health, my recovery from my eye infection. It helped me to manage my kind of social isolation that I'd had for a long time. So it really, stepping in to try and make change really, really helped me massively. And in fact, has kind of gone on to influence the founding of the New Citizen Project and all of the work that we've done in the kind of nearly 15 years since that time. And I guess at the time that all this was happening, my ex-colleague John Alexander, who I used to work with even before the travel, I used to work in advertising agencies, and he had been exploring this idea of citizenship at a theoretical level. So he'd been exploring what it means to treat people as consumers, and how priming people as consumers can have a really negative impact on their propensity to act positively for society. And he'd been sort of doing some thinking around that. Anyway, we came together just after I'd started sort of becoming active in this campaign, and he'd started to explore these ideas of citizenship. And we sat and had a coffee one day, and we were meant to meet for like an hour, and we were still there 4 hours later, chatting and chatting. And I kept saying to him, and he kept saying to me, this thing that I said to John, I think this thing that you're theorizing about, I'm experiencing, I'm living. I think I am experiencing right now what it is to be an active citizen as opposed to a passive consumer. And I think that's really interesting. And what if we could get more people to think in this way? And act in this way? What if we could get the institutions and the organizations that are in society to start to facilitate and enable people who've had experiences like mine to do them more? That is the very compressed but still quite long story of the birth of the New Citizen Project. So yeah, we set up in 2014. It was John and I and a colleague of ours, Iris, and we've been doing this work ever since.
Yeah. And it was Iris, I think, who ran the training course I went on, if I remember rightly, as well. And so, I mean, you started to explain it anyway, but maybe it's worth for our listeners to really spell out, I suppose, either the ethos of new citizenship and or the sort of citizen shift that you started to describe. How would you sort of put it in a nutshell?
Yeah, so if I talk a little bit about the kind of theory that sits behind our work, which John developed through the university course that he was on at the time when we reconnected and had been kind of exploring and experiencing. So the theory goes that there are at any one time there's a kind of dominant story of a kind of story of self and story of society, and that story kind of shapes and influences the way that society is structured and kind of infuses all of society with a kind of logic that it's determined by. And we tell these three stories in our theory: the story of the subject, the story of the consumer, and then the story of the citizen. And in the book, people can read about it even more, but in the time that we've got now, basically it's worth saying that any one time one of these stories becomes dominant, starts to dominate and infuse in the way that our society is structured and runs, that coming out of the end of the two world wars, beginning of the 20th century, we might have been something like subjects of the king, subjects of the state, and for the best possible society to result, maybe the role of people, the role of individuals within that society was to obey, to be compliant, to listen to the people that were in charge, to receive their wisdom and all of the things that they believed needed to happen. And if we were compliant, passive subjects of the state, then the strong people at the top would create good societies. And then coming out of that into kind of latter part of the 20th century, we often talk about the year 1984 as being a kind of seminal moment in the arrival of a new story, the story of the consumer. And there's some amazing stuff in the book about this consumer story taking over from the subject story and being a really liberating thing, a really positive shift at the time, allowing people more choice, allowing people to be less dependent on the state and act more independently, to choose between a variety of options that weren't available before. And obviously commerce takes off at that point, and society really starts to kind of flourish, and you have economic booms because of the arrival of the consumer story and this idea that we are individuals who are able to, through our purchase decisions, our transactional choices, kind of shape a better society. Yeah, also emerges. So you get organisations and institutions. I don't know, a really funny story. I think what's it called? Live Aid happened in 1984. The Body Shop floated on the stock exchange. Madonna releases Material Girl. And
I've just been watching Stranger Things. It just reminded me of all that as well, in terms of all that sort of consumerism in that program.
And it's not a negative thing. It's the arrival of a new story that is empowering and exciting, and it's giving people kind of more options to shape the society around them. But if you fast forward to 2025, that consumer story, is absolutely reached its limits. We have a climate and ecological crisis that is unspeakable in very many ways. We have enormous inequality in our society, a crisis of social isolation and loneliness. And lots of these issues and problems we identify as kind of having their root in the idea that people are consumers who act in their own self-interest in the short term, who are not seeing their interdependence and interconnectedness with the society around them.
And they're not crises that we're going to consume a way out of necessarily either, are they?
Exactly. And John often talks about you can't solve these problems from the logic of the story that created them in the first place. So you can't solve an ecological and climate crisis from a story that tells you that you can just have and accumulate more and more things and produce more and more things without planetary boundaries or limits. The idea is that, you can't. Well, we're not going to be able to solve our problems by staying in this consumer mindset. And so when we set up NCP in 2014, and ever since then, we've been trying to catalyse and observing and seeing the idea that the citizen story is emerging. And actually, we see our role as NCP to really kind of fuel and equip organisations to step into that citizen story. In the citizen story, just as the story that I told you about my own personal experience of kind of discovering my agency and my ability to shape things around me for the better, the citizen story is about people recognising their interdependence with each other, recognising that rather than to be served or to demand, that their role is to create and be creative. And within that story, as I said, the role of institutions and organisations might be to enable, facilitate, to equip people to be more active participants in society. And our theory also goes that if we have more active, flourishing and participatory societies, then maybe we'll be able to address some of these challenges that the consumer story has created. So that's the kind of theory that sits behind what we do. And lots of our work is about, as I say, equipping organisations to think about people differently, to not think of people as consumers who don't care and just want to be served, and think of them instead as creative, capable citizens who really want to shape things around them for the better.
I think that's a really interesting distinction, and one I think for lots of us to think about. I guess bringing it back to some really tangible things that sort of particularly leaders or volunteers are thinking about. And one of the things I think your work has really challenged me around is how we talk about and how we think about working with and engaging with volunteers, particularly from a communications point of view, right? I'm sure I am not the first person. I'm sure other people have heard this kind of comparison of people going, these people are our customers, these people are our, these are the people we're here to support, or these are the people we're here to serve, sort of thing. And I think that sort of citizen mindset really changes that. Like you start to think about your communications in a pretty different way, I think, when you start to think, actually, these people are part of my team, these people are active participants, these people are
partners.
Yeah, partners. And I think that's interesting as well, and I think particularly when you layer on the subject story of that as well, because often we can, particularly big organizations coordinating lots of people, like sometimes I think we can feel like the ivory tower that is the subject story, right? And we want to feel more like the partner in the room, which is the citizen story, where people has agency and has chances to collaborate and participate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, do you know what else I think happens is that because this story is so dominant, and because maybe in charity world there is a bit more subject than consumer, even, maybe there's still the kind of like paternalistic charity knows best attitude in lots of places, not everywhere and in all people, but certainly a story that still exists in that space. I think that primes people to act particularly differently. So you do get a different response sometimes from volunteers as well. They aren't being asked to shape and create, and they're not being kind of enabled in the same way. And so they default into a slightly more kind of passive and accepting role. And I think that it's really funny when you sort of point people in the direction of being a bit more citizen, being a bit more kind of stepping into shape and create. And at the end of sessions that we've done with people like that, they've kind of been like, no, no one's ever asked me what I thought about how we do this before, but it's really nice to be able to contribute. Or
Mm-hmm.
I've never really thought that X organisation wanted to know what I thought or what I felt about something.
And I think what's also really interesting is some of these things are really getting back to for lots of organizations and charities. This citizen story, right, will be really getting back to basics as why lots of those organizations started in the first place, because they started because I imagine lots of people have similar stories to the one of yours, of like local people in local communities trying to solve a problem that was in front of them as citizens, right? Not because there was a volunteer or a volunteer opportunity they signed up for to be part of a wider organization. They were solving problems as they saw them in front of them, and that that gained momentum and turned into a movement, or whatever you want to use that language to describe that. And and gradually those things get bigger and bigger and bigger, and and this, things change in that. But some of that's about, for me, is like about getting back to basics, right? It's like, what did we all turn up here to do in the first place, and how can we recapture some of that?
And so many of those charities were set up and had society in their name in the first place. It was societies. I remember lots of people, the Parkinson's Disease Society and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And they were set up, by motivated, passionate individuals or groups with fire in their belly and something that they felt needed to change and be improved. And I think, going back to that and reconnecting with that part of themselves, even if you can't kind of go, obviously, all the way back to that beginning and those roots for very good reasons.
They were born out of voluntary and civic action, weren't they?
Yeah.
It's funny, we were all on the same wavelength. As Matt was asking the question, I was just asking Google which big household charities were founded through voluntary action.
Yeah.
And it is. I've only given you a few here, but it's the RVS, it's the British Red Cross, it's the Salvation Army, Neighbourhood Watch, your organisation, Matt, Memody Association. They all were founded by people who saw an injustice and didn't step back and say, "Well, let the politicians sort this out." They said, well, we as citizens can do something about this. Your story, Irene, is exactly that, isn't it? That's how movements start. And I think you're right, Matt, that somehow as volunteering organisations grow, though, sometimes we lose sight of that, don't we? Yeah. It becomes more about providing a service, and volunteers do it. Almost, it is a bit more the subject story, like you say. Volunteers are doing what they're asked to do. They're fulfilling roles. They're following guidelines. But we forget the power. It's that Margaret Mead quote, isn't it? I always butcher the quote, but that nobody should doubt the power of a few well-meaning individuals to change the world. In fact, they're the only thing that ever does. It's that kind of thing, isn't it?
I know, absolutely. It's really true. I think a good friend and kind of fellow traveller on this journey. I don't necessarily subscribe to the language, but I like the sentiment behind it. He is very big advocate for patient involvement within the NHS and patient leadership within the NHS. David Gilbert is his name, and he's brilliant. And he wrote a book which is called The Patient Revolution. And one of his phrases was about people that know stuff, people who've been through stuff and know stuff and want to change stuff. And then he talks about kind of people bringing the jewels of wisdom from the caves of suffering, which again, it's not my favorite language in terms of how that's expressed, but the idea that people who have been through stuff and know stuff and want to change stuff, you can apply to absolutely every social endeavour in the world. And what I think is really interesting is that the latent power that those people have, people who want to change stuff but feel express a frustration that the system doesn't allow them to step into that power. It is the potential here in the citizen story, for all the professionalisation of organisations and charities that are doing really important work. It's sort of like an untapped resource in in the people that really, really love them, care about and support them. And if we can harness that, what could we achieve?
And a shout out to some of our past guests. Springing to mind, Michael Phillips at Crisis and Anne-Marie Zawitsky at Mencap, who I've been talking about their organisations taking a bit of a step back in terms of being much more of a convener of people and providing the space for people to bring their latent talents, their diverse perspectives, their lived experiences to find their own solutions to a shared purpose. And sometimes, like a crisis I've got in mind is, working with other organisations, not just working with crisis volunteers, but saying, well, actually, let's work with communities wherever they may be, wherever homelessness is, and empower them to find solutions that work. So there's definitely some really good work in that space that's happening. But what do we need to be doing, I suppose, to I mean, a lot of our listeners will be heads of volunteering or volunteer managers. Some of them will be CEOs and directors in charities who kind of want to intellectually make that shift, but practically it's quite difficult to go from maybe the subject, probably the consumer story, but definitely into the citizenship bit. Have you got any sort of tips about how they can sort of go on that journey?
Yeah, so I guess this is where the kind of theory translates into what NCP, the organisation, kind of does on a day-to-day basis. And obviously we take that subject consumer citizen story and hold it in our minds. But then I guess one of the ways that we like to think about this is, so we've got these, Chris, you'll have obviously come across these through the bootcamp training, but these three kind of principles of participatory organisations, so purpose, platform and prototype. So purpose is just basically about articulating what it is that you're trying to do in the world that's so big that you need the other people, who believe in it too, to do it with you. And so articulating a clear kind of sense of purpose that feels participatory, that's not about you as the champion, the strongman leader necessarily, but instead is expressed in a way that means that other people have a role in it as well. So think about that, articulating that kind of participatory purpose. The second kind of principle is platform, and that's all about thinking about how you can go from kind of deliverer to enabler. So rather than mobilizing volunteers to execute your instructions or to participate in your campaigns, can you instead take a couple of steps back and think about yourselves as an enabler, a facilitator? How can you create the structures and the processes to allow people to come in and start to shape things? And that all sounds really easy when I say it like that. And of course, it's really it's not easy. It's hard. And so our third principle is all about prototyping. So rather than trying to turn around the whole ship in one turn, what are the opportunities that you might have to test and explore different ways of working that allow you to work slightly more in that kind of side by side, co-creating together, shaping together, on a few discrete kind of areas or projects, and then can you test, learn, and go again? So can you just practice your way there, as opposed to setting a strategy, rolling it out, and throwing everything up in the air, which obviously is really hard to do when you're in a head of role or in a volunteer manager role, and you want to do things differently. It's a big risk to chuck everything in the sky. So we try and help people to think about how they might iterate, practice their way there, and take small steps. And over the years that we've been doing this work, we know that that's an effective approach, because some of the best case studies that we've worked with, not necessarily in volunteering, but in other places, have really demonstrated that this work can take time, but taking that iterative approach allows you to build the allies that you need internally to ensure that other people kind of oversee what you're doing and can be encouraged and enthused by it, rather than seeing it as a threat. And over time, that kind of build those participatory muscles for the organisation.
I think that prototyping idea is a really interesting one, and one it'd be really interesting to explore in a little bit more detail, because I think I often talk on this podcast about how the world of volunteering and volunteer involvement, a lot of where we take our sort of structure and our thinking from is almost, or at least traditionally where we've taken it from, right, is translating some of the world of like HR and people practice into sort of citizenship and participation, and where do you go? So job description becomes a role description. We talk about how do we deliver effective reviews. We talk about recruitment. We talk about things like that. Now, there's not necessarily anything wrong with those things, and there might be things we still need to think about. When I think about how New Citizen Project works, you use a lot of design thinking, right? That's where you draw a lot of your approaches and thinking from, which comes up with like, let's generate lots of ideas. Let's like test these out. Let's see what works. Let's try it and then iterate it and develop it. Like, and that just by its very nature feels less subject, less consumer, much more citizen in nature than perhaps some of the other areas we draw from traditionally in the world of volunteering.
Yeah, I completely agree. And don't get me wrong, I'm like enormous respect for the importance of those structures and processes, like particularly like to do with things like safeguarding and making sure that people are at, the contracting is good and clear, the terms of their participation are kind of set, they're going to be safe and protected, and so are the people that they're going to be working with. Like all of those things are really, really important. So I'm not advocating for throwing those out, and that's why I'm advocating for taking a prototyping approach. And you're right, Matt. That kind of emergence of design thinking and not quite knowing where you're going, but framing a question together. We often talk about framing questions as in that kind of design thinking way of how might we, together with X, achieve Y. And just setting that question as the kind of topic for the engagement and the participation, as opposed to, we've got to, we're going to refresh all our patient information, or we're going to refresh all our, our materials, and we'd like a panel to review them. That's it's a different task, and it's not as generative for people. So yeah, I think I agree that the freedom of that, the emergence, is both really exciting and creative, and for people in those jobs can be really invigorating. People often talk to us about, it's the most exciting part of the work that I do day to day. I'm most excited here. Yeah, I think that's sort of the potential for that is enormous, and can get you to less expensive flops. So because stuff's been prototyped, it's been tested, you learn, you make all the mistakes on the journey, but it's so low risk because every time you're testing something small, that it doesn't matter as much. It's not,
Presumably it's localized as well, potentially at least. So, because one of the temptations in organizations is always to find a one size fits all model. And because you're prototyping, and because they're often quite small prototypes, presumably you can come to a point where you can say, well, actually, long as our purpose is the same, it might be that there are different solutions for different communities in different locations, and you can prototype slightly different ways of doing things. So it's not, again, you end up enforcing a common way of doing things on people. Instead of that, you're actually saying, this is the outcome we're looking for. This is the impact we're looking for. But actually, let's work together as partners to find solutions that not just work, but work in local scenarios or in different teams and so on as well.
Absolutely. And then how might you, can you have comfort with a kind of bit more of a plurality of approaches and things like that, as long as your vision is really aligned? Yeah, you said as the impact needs to be X, but also what we're all sat behind is a belief in, these values, or a belief that things need to change in this way. But then what I think is really interesting is, so say you develop some of those local approaches, and you end up kind of with a thriving program, community, volunteers in one particular part, and then some people over here are doing something different. Then what's really exciting is when you start to share
Yeah.
And learn, and suddenly you're inspiring folks over here with something that those people over there have done, and then you've got a movement that's moving without you, and that feels really exciting.
And I often, just in a volunteering perspective, maybe this is a bit of inherent frustration sometimes with organisational life from a volunteering perspective, I don't know, is that we we have a database of people who are volunteers for an organization, or if we're lucky, participants. We might get into the difference or the crossovers later on. And then somewhere else in a big organization, there'll be a list of members. Somewhere else, there'll be a list of donors. Somewhere else, there'll be a list of fundraisers. And then within the volunteer, we might have campaigners. And, there's all these different people who are all presumably aligned around the same cause, that they're there because they believe in whatever the organization's trying to achieve. So there's already some kind of shared purpose. But we treat them as completely different entities. We deal with them in different teams. Often, by the way, they're the same person, but they've getting communication from 5 and 6 different channels and being treated as if they're a different person every time they're spoken to, almost. That's something attractive to me in the sort of consumerist approach. I think at least in that partnership, collaborative kind of space, that you then can start to say, well, actually, instead of who's the donor, who's the fundraiser, who's the volunteer, you start really just saying, who's the supporter of this cause, who wants to actively participate in finding solutions to whatever our problems are, our challenges are at the time. And it becomes a little bit more inclusive, potentially. This does in my mind, because we stop pigeonholing people, stop putting hats on them and saying, actually, who wants to help solve this problem?
Yeah, because if you ended up on the campaign's mailing list, why wouldn't you want to come and do some peer support? Why wouldn't you want to talk to somebody whose family had gone through the thing that that you experienced? Or what? People don't categorize themselves in the same way that the institution does for their own fees. People don't fit into those neat segmentations. I think in my experience anyway, of working with a lot of citizens and through the campaigning work that I've done with my own eye condition, it's like, oh, there's a job that needs to be done. Yeah, no, if I've got something to contribute, then I'm quite up for doing that. So I think what that leads to is a reimagining of how you might hold that relationship across an entire charity, an entire organization, and allow it to be a bit more fluid, allow people to go where their energy feels like it should be, and not to categorize them too much with a defined role that means that they only ever do or participate in this way.
And it also means that the ownership of that direction doesn't necessarily sit purely at the centre of the organisation. It means it's back to that thing about you said about societies or associations. They're bodies of those words for me portray a community of people who come together and coalesce around a challenge or around a cause. They're not people serving an organisation who's organised for the centre. It's a much more devolved way of thinking. And thank you as well I forgot probably the most important group when I put all my little list of people together, the people who are actually service beneficiaries, who of course themselves want to be active citizens in shaping, well, sometimes want to be active citizens in shaping the thing that's very close, presumably, to their heart. So there's also an opportunity to involve them. And again, we often think of them as service beneficiaries over here, volunteers over there. Well, that's not how the real world works.
Yeah, and you folks, you will both know a lot more about how those volunteers arrive with you. But I would guess that it is that kind of coming back to that kind of fire in their belly about something that they've been through, or a loved one has been through, or something that they think needs to change.
And where it led me, I don't know if you would agree, harping back to Iris's boot camp, there was a slide, I won't remember all the words, but on there were things like, it's about how people can participate. So it was telling stories, generating ideas, leveraging contacts, I'm probably using the wrong phraseology, introduced to a friend, co-produced ideas, raise cash, those sort of things. And it's a really good crib list, actually, of how...
Well remembered, by the way.
Well, I think it was thereabouts, wasn't it?
7 modes of participation, right?
Exactly that, modes of participation. And I think there's something about the shift, and I often use this when I talk to clients, is because it's really simple, but there's a powerful shift there that says, actually, volunteering isn't about fulfilling a fairly well-defined prescriptive role, something that's kind of managed and micromanaged by a volunteer manager. That might be the case, but it's also, if you start getting into telling stories, for instance, you're immediately into something much more creative, much more personalized, much more, exactly, telling a story. Telling your story is a really personal thing, as you demonstrated at the top of this show. And that's a really powerful thing, which often service users, volunteers, others can do much better than staff. But also it means we're into the realms of participation, small actions, often without any really involvement of a volunteer manager whatsoever. And the role of the volunteer manager, where it does exist, I suppose, sort of shifts to enabler, facilitator, convener. And it's a very different skill set for a volunteer manager, but I think it's one that really must be in our toolkit, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something really interesting about the difference between, as you were alluding to before, Chris, the volunteers in this box over here and the members in this box over here, and then these, like, and also we want to be a more participatory, active, thriving organization, so we've got participants over here, but they're all driving at one goal. I'm interested in what you think about whether that's a different skill set or not for volunteer managers. I guess you'd recruit for certain qualities, right, and certain experience, which is about your knowledge of the systems and processes and the governance, and making sure that, as we said before, both the volunteers and the beneficiaries and all the other people are safeguarded and appropriately contracted. I would like to think that you could make those volunteer manager and heads of volunteering and directors of these roles just feel like they have more agency to shape the way that they work with people as well, which I hope would then reflect in, greater job satisfaction for those individuals, and more variety in what they're doing day to day, and more creativity and agency in their own role. So I kind of feel like it's a win-win, but I wonder
Oh,
what
it
you
is.
both
It is a
think.
win-win. Yeah, for sure.
I think, and we've been talking about this recently on podcasts, right? It feels like I'm having more conversations about this generally, about like volunteering not just being put in buckets, and there not being like a true version of volunteering, as it were. And I think this links back to almost like what I was saying earlier about like where we draw how we work from, right? Because I think if you take this mindset of, well, we draw our idea of how we're working from people processes, you start to get this idea of best practice almost and what you're trying to aspire to. And I think if you take these more participatory approaches, design thinking, citizen mindset, you start to get towards, I think, this idea that there is a spectrum of volunteer involvement. There is all different kinds of things that people do with their time that are helping benefit organizations. If some of those things are really big, very committed, very regular things, and some of those things are smaller, one-off, ad hoc, they might not even be direct impact, but they're contributing, they're telling a story, they're learning about something, they're taking an interest in something. And all these different kind of participation points, like that's volunteering, right? It's not like one thing, it's all of these things. And I'm sure there's lots of people out there grappling with this idea of, well, what does volunteering mean in my organization now? My sense is that's changed quite a lot over the course of my career. I think we put volunteering in a particular box kind of at our peril to some extent. It limits us, and it moves us away from where lots of these things started off, which were the agency of people in local communities to try and solve a problem or develop a solution that they perceived, right? And that is inherently creative and inherently flexible. It's kind of whatever it takes to meet that challenge. I'm just really inspired by the way you've thought about it, certainly at New Citizen Project.
I think the one skill, if I could wave a magic wand and give one skill to all people that work in volunteering, it would probably be facilitation. To be able to hold conversations in groups, to hold meaningful space with people, and to be able to equip them to step in a particular direction. I think that would be my magic moment for volunteering, would be that they can also hold space for a bit more of that emergent thinking. I know it was a really nice example of a particular client that we were working with, and it was a story where we were exploring new initiatives that the organisation could take that were more participatory, and somebody within one of our groups was talked about the issue not landing particularly well in schools. This was a younger person, and the suggestion was that she would like to go and talk more about the topic in schools and raise awareness and help understanding and help educators and fellow students to connect with this issue and have more empathy and understanding for it. And kind of as we were developing the idea, the processes got in the way, and it was like, oh no, you can't, we have to set up a project initiation document for this and we have to take it to this board, and it became sort of encumbered by all of the process that is there to ensure quality assurance and quality control and to make sure that things are done appropriately and well. But it was just, that person could have just gone and done a brilliant job and had been supported and equipped by the organisation and had impact, and then that might have spread, and you never know what could have got off the ground. And I guess one of the things that I'm quite interested in is how you can shift from gathering insight to drive what you do as an organisation. So investing your money in research, in market research, to understand how people feel and what they think and what they do, so that then you can develop and deliver services for them. If you just worked with your closest people, wouldn't that say wouldn't you not then need to go and do the insight gathering? Because if you could co-create with people, then your insights would be rooted in people with lived experience. And I know, just to qualify that by saying, there are within every kind of supporter base people who are seldom heard, people who aren't as close to the organisation and things like that. And you have to then take active steps to include them in the conversation too.
But you could be leveraging, I mean, I agree, you need to have that proviso in there, but by talking to your people, whoever they are within your community, that's back to that list of items for me, in terms of one of those is leveraging your reach. Each of those people are going to know other people. When they're going to have those connections that could be leveraged in a really powerful way, but we don't often think to use them. It's in some ways, it's almost like a mini ice bucket challenge. Somebody knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, and there are ways to sort of leverage some of the power that communities have, and one of their powers has got to be they're just broad reach that they have. I was wondering about, sorry, just changing tack completely, but as you was talking earlier on, I was wondering about if you've ever been involved in sort of community organising stuff in the States, because some of the things you were sort of describing to me about the difference between how volunteer management needs to be and is increasingly being, and some of the more traditional models. And I was thinking of some of the community organising activities that happens particularly in cities in the United States, that has that kind of feel to it to me. It's like, let's identify the problem, let's get the community to coalesce around it and find the solutions. I don't know if you've...
that shift from mobilise to organise, I think, is really interesting to us. We've not actively done work in community organising in the States, but have admired many of the examples that have come out of that side of things, and definitely interested in what does it mean to... So if you're mobilising, you're inviting or instructing or encouraging your supporters to get involved in this activity, versus organising, where you're out and distributed across the community and listening and talking and enabling people to make suggestions and come up with solutions and do stuff in small cohorts together. And I think there's a lot to learn from charities and other organisations on just making that mindset shift from mobilising people to organising people.
And we've talked a lot about volunteering, naturally enough, because this is a volunteering podcast, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity just to tell us a bit more about the sort of wider scope of the New Citizens Project in terms of other arenas you work in, from commercial to councils through to citizens assemblies or whatever. It'd be. I think our listeners would appreciate hearing a bit more about the broader work that you do.
So we want to see this participatory society because we think it will drive, some of the structural and societal problems that we're faced with in this time that we're living in. But yeah, what we're interested in is all organizations that have a relationship with stakeholders of some description. So sometimes they're customers, sometimes we work a lot in government, and particularly, as you said, in local government, trying to get local government to make the kind of culture shift from being a service provider that delivers services for residents in a particular place to an enabler of citizens to help their places to flourish better. And again, it's that shift from we'll deliver everything, and then in the consumer model, you get blamed, you get complained at, you never do anything right, your resources don't stretch far enough, you're not making the right choices in terms of how you're allocating those resources as a council officer or a local authority employee. If you start to think about how you can work more side by side with citizens and involve them in those decision-making processes. So there's some really exciting examples of participatory budgeting where citizens can help make decisions about, spending allocation, particular pots of money within a local authority context, or citizens assemblies, which many of your listeners will have heard of and hopefully be interested in as really good examples of deliberative democracy and how citizens can shape policy or make recommendations on really, really crunchy topics and step forward into those. We've done lots more of that work in the last 2-3 years, to even working with purposeful businesses who want to have a different relationship with their customers, who see their customers as kind of helping them to achieve impact in the world through helping them to have that impact, and how can those businesses be a facilitator. So the avenues to us kind of wanting to work with people are very varied, and basically we want to work with anyone who has stakeholders of any kind to get them to think less consumer and more citizen, and to explore the possibilities of what might happen there. And I think what's really interesting about that is what happens if you take a bit more of a systems approach. So one of the bits of work I'm most proud of from our time in NCP has been the development of the People's Plan for Nature, which we were involved in from the very earliest stages. We were working with RSPB at the time on participation and supporter experience and things like that. And then that led to this early idea for a participatory process, make recommendations to tackle the kind of nature crisis, the biodiversity crisis in the UK, and to make recommendations for the future of British nature, to restore, protect nature in the UK. And it started off as a what if we did this project with RSPC. And then we talked about how we could try and involve other stakeholders, other actors across the system, the whole system. It's really interesting from your conversation with Crisis, actually, maybe, Chris. But could you bring together other NGOs in the nature space? So we ended up bringing in WWF and the National Trust. So it was RSPB, WWF and the National Trust who commissioned this participatory process. But then we reached out to the Co-op and Aviva, who were corporate partners of some of those NGOs, and then sort of said to them, well, what could your role be in the development of the People's Plan for Nature? How could you help shape the future of this process? And so Co-op came in, Aviva set up the community fund. And so the reason I'm so proud of that piece of work, even though we weren't kind of central to it for its entirety, from kind of conceiving of and then designing the process, we tried to take this systems approach that said, look, this is a crunchy problem. The NGOs aren't going to solve it by themselves, and we don't just want policy recommendations for the NGOs. We want to make recommendations across the whole system. We want to all take a systems approach, and that means thinking about what can the NGOs do, of course, but also what could government do at the national and local level? what should everyday citizens be doing to restore and protect British nature? What should businesses do? And the Citizens Assembly that sat at the heart of it made recommendations across the whole system, and made recommendations for citizens too, which then kind of got picked up through this community funds that Aviva were doing, that allowed people to kind of get match funding for projects that they wanted to do that restored nature. So I love the idea. This is going back, zooming back out again. But some of these crunchy things that you're working with volunteers on, or with participants or members, can also become kind of gigantic collaborations that try and tackle some of those crunchy things. I'm really interested in the role of charities and NGOs to start to take a bit more of a, oh we'll do, will you come in, we'll start, will you come in, and then who else can we build into this coalition, how can we all take action together? I think that's really, really exciting.
It's interesting because some of that is almost the basis of community organising at a very sort of local level as well. It's applying that to society-wide level. If you take an asset-based approach, who in this community has got the skills and the ability to move this thing forward? Who can help, and what can you bring to the table, and how together can we solve this problem? It feels like if you take that sort of asset-based thinking and you see like the whole of society as as someone who might have something to contribute, like, that's pretty powerful, I think.
And then thinking back to the impact on the participants, because that's also at the heart of what we're always thinking about and doing. So the participants should have, as you know, you're experts in this, but an enriching, empowering, wonderful experience. They should feel so proud of the thing that they've done. And if they feel like their contribution is part of a gigantic thing that's trying to shift a system in this direction, then surely that's going to feel even more strong and more powerful, and lead to that kind of network effect of lots and lots of other people stepping in as well. So
yeah, it just grows and grows and grows, but it's so exciting, and just just the very concept of just connecting people up and giving them the agency, and whatever people, organizations, whoever it might be, and organizations are made of people, but giving them the agency to know that they have the ability and the power to make a meaningful difference. I mean, for me, that feels what it's all about, and that's such a powerful statement, and it should be obvious to everybody, but unfortunately, as you described through the subject and consumer story, perhaps that's kind of been driven out of us a little bit. And it's so exciting to hear about your work and the drive and the partnerships that you're having to shift that thinking and shift. The world we live in at the moment is pretty tumultuous, isn't it? And if we were to sit back and say that we got no power, no agency to shift that, that's quite depressing. But actually we do have more power than just voting once every 4 or 5 years. We could do a lot more to change the societies we live in. So for me, all power to New Citizens Project and everybody you work with, because that's the kind of stuff that's going to change the societies that we live in. Yeah, so thanks. Well, that's a wrap up, but thanks for sharing those stories with us. Do you want to tell people how they would get in touch with yourself and with the project if they want to work with you?
Absolutely. So we're newcitizenproject.com. You can find us online. You can also search, the work of John Alexander, who's, as I say, my co-founder at NCP. And there's a whole bunch of videos and talks and amazing things that he's spoken about. That if you want to dig into the theory, would be really good to look into. Yeah, but thank you for having me.
Brilliant. So thanks for joining us, Irenie. It's been a
Thank you both.
cracking conversation.
Yeah, lovely to chat to you. I really enjoyed it.
Well, Matt, I mean, you and I have always been fans of the New Citizens Project, so you and I were never going to be disappointed by that episode, I suspect. What are your takeaways? What are your highlights from Irenie's input this evening?
First thing I say is, if you enjoyed the podcast today, I would go and check out the book called Citizens. It's a really good, really easy to read book, and it's full of just inspirational ideas and examples. And it really, without being too heavy, really unpacks some of these things in a way that, with real life examples, these things in practice, really, really interesting read. And, come back to our very first podcast, as Matt Hick told us, leaders are readers. So that is a good one to maybe to start your reading with. So that's my first suggestion. I think this idea of a citizen shift is a really helpful one in terms of thinking about how we do things, because I think it's a really fundamental mindset shift. And I think once you've spent a bit of time with this, it gives you a license really to question a lot of what you might be doing. What frame of reference is what I'm doing here? Is it a subject? Is it a consumer? Is it a citizen mindset? Is this communication written to consumers or citizens? Is the way I'm approaching this project involving people collaboratively, bringing in a range of voices, and really interested and invested in building something together? That's probably more of a citizen mindset. Yeah, and I think what I would say on a personal level is this has kind of really helped me, and I've been quite inspired by this work. I think lots of people who've been involved in volunteering for a while, like, the fact that you should involve people, right, isn't, I don't think, a new concept to us, or will be many to us, right? Like, that people involved in things, when you involve people, when people's voices help shape things, you end up with better results, right? I don't think that's a new concept, but this enables this kind of thinking, and this methodology, I think, really enables us to sort of extrapolate that, like, beyond just how we build things into really how we work sort of holistically. It was interesting. We didn't get a chance perhaps to dig quite as far into some of the citizens assembly stuff, but really how to make decisions, how we talk to people, how we can be more creative. And I think that design philosophy, design thinking approach is a really important and interesting one as well. Again, sort of dig into some of that, using things like double diamond processes and bits and pieces. Have a look at that if you're interested in it. But it's really this idea of trying things, building things together, exploring and experimenting, learning from mistakes, developing and iterating and making it better. And all of that is a really exciting new way to do things if you've not done it before. And yeah, I can't say good enough things about, working with New Citizen Project, but perhaps not everyone has the luxury of that. But what I would also say is read the book, and their website also has a huge amount of brilliant resources as well, where you can understand and explore some of this thinking in a bit more detail, for sure.
Absolutely.
What about you, Chris? Any thoughts?
Well, I think you covered it, but I'd say, just to add to that, that if they do release the membership boot camps, whatever they're going to call it in the future, even if you're not involved in membership, get yourself booked onto one of their training courses. It really is an eye-opener. Hopefully you've had some of that through the podcast tonight, but you get into a lot more detail, a lot more practical tips on how you can really start to rethink your involvement of people in your organizations. Highly recommended. So yeah, another podcast done and dusted. Hopefully lots to take away for everybody listening. As I say at the end, I think pretty much every episode, if you liked it, share the podcast with at least one other person. That would be fantastic. And if you want to give us a rating or a review, that's always much appreciated too. And even there's an opportunity, I think I said once before, to buy Matt and I a cup of coffee. We provide these podcasts free of charge as our gift to the profession of volunteerism. If you want to say thank you, we'd always appreciate it. You can do that even just by leaving a comment. But if you want to go onto our Buy a Coffee page, please do as well. There's always a link to that in the show notes as well. So, but for now, thanks, Matt. Another great episode.
Thanks, Chris. All the best. Until next time.
Bye. Hey everyone, Chris Wade here again from Time for Impact. Wow, that was a fantastic podcast. I hope you agree. Just a quick note from me at the end, after hearing from Irenie, just to remind you all that Time for Impact is, of course, more than just a podcast. We provide consultancy, training, and much, much more. Please do get in touch if you think we can help you modernise and revolutionise thinking about volunteering in your organisation. Until the next time, thanks very much. Bye.